Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 73, and today I'm here with Seth Perler talking about executive function. Seth is a well-known executive function coach, educator, vlogger, and guy who cares about seeing outside-the-box kids succeed. This means that he helps struggling neurodiverse learners turn it around in a baffling system so they can launch into a successful future. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. In an episode about executive function, I have to remind you that the bucket system is there to support all families, though especially families with neurodivergence and executive function challenges, through the daily tasks of individual and communal well-being. The bucket system fosters independence through a collaborative and sensory approach to home care, self-care, and homeschooling. Through this system, we see our children through a strength-based lens and lean into self-directed learning, embrace neurodiversity, and provide just enough executive function support for independence and responsibility to blossom. I'm talking chores done, learning practiced, challenges supported. If any of that resonates with you, go to sagefamily.com/bucket-system and join the course today. Welcome to the show, Seth. Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Rachel. My name is Seth Perler, and I am an executive function coach, speaker, person who wears a lot of hats in the executive function world. But what my intention is to help usually struggling students who have these legitimate executive function challenges. They struggle to get important things done. And my intention is to figure out how to help them, but in such a way where we really ask the right questions about the system and their life so that they can figure out how to execute, but not just to be compliant, but so that they can really build a good life for themselves.
Okay, so let's start by defining what executive function is for those out there who don't already know.
Executive function is how the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the front third of your brain, if you put your hand over your forehead right now, you'll know where that is, how that part of your brain helps you to execute. Now, what we're usually talking about in my work is I'm usually talking about kids. Usually I'm talking about middle, high school, and college students, although I sometimes work with younger kids or young adults, etc. But usually by the time they're in middle school, when they have legitimate executive function challenges, there's a lot of red flags, and the parents are really concerned that they are struggling to get really important things done. And there might be a lot of homework battles or battles with getting responsibilities done. And the parents are concerned that if they don't figure out how to get things done, that it may really impact their future. And they're rightly concerned because it can. So what happens is that front part of the brain helps us to do certain really important things. It helps us to manage time, to get organized, to prioritize the important thing over the fun thing or the more interesting thing or the easier thing when it matters. For example, you might prioritize getting your homework done over playing video games. That might be a really obvious example. And it helps us to do that. I talk about 13 different executive functions, but essentially you don't need to know all of that. What you need to know is that it's anything that the brain needs to do. And we can go into more detail later, but anything that the brain needs to do in order to get important things done.
So, what are some indicators that your child might be struggling with executive functioning skills? I know you mentioned like not turning in homework or choosing to work on homework over video games.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. There are so many things. So if your child is struggles with motivation, focus, getting homework done, follow through, maybe they start homework but they don't finish it, procrastination and getting started, being on time, um, a lot of traits that you would think of classic ADHD. So with the attention, focus, and concentration, they get distracted really easily. Um, a lot of times kids who struggle with executive function aren't really systems thinkers. They tend to be very big picture global thinkers. And so remembering details can be really hard. So maybe you say, hey, go grab these three things and meet me in the car. We got to run. And then like 10 minutes later, you're like, where are you? And they haven't grabbed any of the three things and they don't even remember what they were. So details can be a big thing. Decision making. A lot of times, if your child struggles with executive function, you might see them making decisions that really are not thought through and where they really haven't reflected and learned from situations in the past and haven't been metacognitive or reflective or self-aware enough to like make a better decision. Sometimes they might be labeled as irresponsible or lazy. The word lazy and irresponsible, those are very misunderstood and misused and very shaming, but so we don't want to say those things, but a lot of times those are ways that you can identify, if people are saying, yeah, this kid's lazy, like has to do with legitimate executive function struggles, not laziness. So those are some of the ways that you can identify it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the families listening are homeschooling families. And so I would say some of the parents on the homeschooling path would come to the realization that their kid is struggling with executive functioning a little bit later, in the sense that their kid is not bumping up against the school system where there are a lot of executive functioning demands being placed on them. So in my experience, like it's a little bit, when most people think of executive functioning, they think about like, it was torture to do the homework. They got the homework done and then they never turned it in, like that kind of stuff. So like specifically in the homeschooling context, it's helpful to hear you talk about like you ask them to go get three things and, meet you in the car, and you come back in 10 minutes later and they've not gathered any of the things and they never came back out to the car.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the homeschooling context, you're going to see the same. So when I talk like about the 13 executive functions, you're going to see the same. You're going to see challenges in the same executive functions, but they might present differently because the demands are obviously going to be very different with homeschool. But you're still going to and I'm glad that you said that, because we do want to clarify for homeschool parents or unschool parents. I'm assuming, are there a lot of unschool parents in your community?
Yes.
Um, that we still want to take this really seriously and know what to look for. So I'll discuss those two things briefly. Does that sound good to you?
Yes, sounds great.
So in terms of taking it seriously and then what to look for a little bit more specifically for homeschool. So taking it seriously, the reason I say that is because one of the nice things about homeschooling is the freedom, the flexibility, the choice, the way that you can really differentiate and customize and tailor and adapt learning experiences to your child. So that's a great thing. But when there are legitimate executive function challenges and there's so much freedom, so the way that I kind of describe it, Rachel, is that you want the least amount of structure possible, but you want the amount of structure and the most freedom possible, but you want the right amount of structure. In other words, When there is tons of freedom and you have executive function challenges, then everything can fall apart. When
Yeah.
there's too much structure, then everything can feel rigid and you can get really resistant. Now, if you don't have executive function challenges and you have pretty strong executive function, then then too much freedom might be really hard for you. You need enough structure so that you know what the expectations are. You're not someone who's really necessarily going to just run with it. You need to have certain guidelines or rules or structures in place, and then you can really rise to the occasion. But with these kiddos, they really need, if it's too unstructured, and they don't have the skill. So these are executive function skills. They don't have the skills built. Then what happens is they tend to waste a lot of time. You tend to notice in like 7th or 8th grade that they're lagging skills that really catch up with them in 7th or 8th grade, like with math and writing. You really notice, wow, my kiddo is in 8th grade and they can't write a 5-paragraph essay, and they can't do basic algebra, or it's taking them absolutely forever to do X, Y, and Z. It just takes them so long because they really don't have the skills in place to know how to manage certain things. So the first thing I wanted to address is like why it's still so important even in the homeschool world. Did I kind of address that?
Yeah, I think like to translate it a bit, because we don't, get so much hooked in like the school's kind of timetables of when kids should be doing something. But from my experience as a homeschooling parent, particularly in like the self-directed learning path, is that I would notice my kid like having a goal for themselves or trying to accomplish something and getting kind of stuck in those lagging skills of being able to execute them. So whatever it is that they're passionate about or interested in, that always involves things like writing or managing time, right? Or like phone calls, or having the kind of structure around like following through and getting 100% of the things done, and on a certain timetable where other people are depending on you. Like all of that kind of stuff is really where I see it in my own family, but then in other families that I work with too.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you said also when other people depend on you, because that's a big time when when we need to use these executive function skills. Yeah, so we want our kids to have a lot of freedom and choices and opportunities and possibilities. So whether we're homeschooling or doing more traditional schools, that's the point of education. So, and when they're really struggling to get important things done, even in the homeschooling context, the the concern is, oh my gosh, what's going to happen when they're 18 or 20 or 30 or 40, and they can't get really, they're going to limit their choices. So the skills for the executive function skills still need to be built. That they don't just come. Now, for somebody who has strong executive function, it seems like they just come, but really they have been practicing for years.
Mm-hmm.
But these kids haven't. So then what I wanted to transition into now would be probably be an appropriate time to talk about, well, what are those skills that you would need even in a homeschool setting?
Yeah, tell me.
So, um, so the first one is going to be skill. So I forget the term you just used, but something reminded me of just sort of like imagine you said even if your child has their own goal, their own thing that's important to them, they
Mm-hmm.
can sometimes shoot themselves in the foot in different ways in terms of wasting time or not accomplishing the goal or not knowing where to go or getting stuck or so.
Yeah.
What is that? So why is that? Well, one of the skills. So in in school we have these tasks to do, and obviously traditional school is very task oriented. You do X, Y, and Z. You get a thing called a letter grade or a number grade that represents supposedly how well you did that, right? So, and I know you're a little familiar with me. I don't know if you're familiar with I don't agree with letter grades. I think
Yes.
they're morally wrong. I use that term. They're morally wrong. Why are we
Yes.
still doing this? But either way, if your kid has a goal of their own, they're going to need to know, number one, how to plan. Now, planning is very complex. So you have a podcast, you have a beautiful website, you have all these offerings, all these ways that you're able to serve human beings.
Thank you.
I mean, that is it is just a matrix I mean, it's so well planned, it's so well thought out, it's so easy to navigate. Um, I mean, you have beautiful images there. You have really tight copy. It's just like you lay it all out for everybody, right? Well, you had to plan. So you're planning to plan you and I meeting today, to plan your editing of the shows, your offerings, all these things. Those are really complex. You are a task manager. You are a project manager. So our kids are project managers too. Now, they might be doing a project like just drawing a picture for fun. Okay, cool. That has no structure, but they may want to get a summer job. And that is a project. We don't necessarily think of it as a project, but that is a project that requires planning. They might want to get a driver's license. Oh my gosh. Can they independently do that? Find their, the documentation they need, make the phone calls, collect the phone numbers. Like, probably not, but what the better their planning skills are, the more they're going to be able to manage that project. So planning skills, you might plan your day, you might plan a semester, you might plan a week, you might plan how to write a paper, you might plan a project that you're doing for fun, you might plan to build a bicycle or a computer, you might plan a trip. But planning, you have long-term and short-term and everything in between types of planning. And it's really complex. It's basically, think of planning as how do we take an outcome or a giant goal, as you use the word goal, how do we take a goal or an outcome, a big, giant goal? And how do we take that big thing and plan by perceiving that thing as a series of subtasks or baby steps or chunks? How do we break it down so that we can accomplish our goal? So that's what planning is about. So that's like number one out of like the 13. But this isn't intuitive for everybody. So now I don't know you, but it seems by looking at your stuff, you seem to have exceptional executive function. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
And my
So
husband has ADHD, and 2 of my children do.
Okay.
So there's a lot of diversity within our family system, but for sure I am the higher executive functioning person in the family.
Yeah. So, in what happens in your brain when it comes to planning is, and in your body too, you have a sense of chaos, and for you, that's very uncomfortable. Now,
Yes.
I don't know you, but I'm just going to tell you what I've learned over many years of doing this. So for you, that sense of chaos is uncomfortable. So you need to look at the subtasks, the chunks, and you need to make order out of them, structure. So you're going to do this thing that we call planning. So you're going to figure out what are the systems, the pieces of this, and how can we sort of plan to execute on the thing. Whereas somebody with ADHD or executive function challenges, chaos is kind of fun and free and everything will be okay. But until it's not, right?
Yeah.
But there's a very different somatic or bodily sense. Like they don't have the same sort of anxiety that helps drive you in a good way.
Yeah.
So then they, will procrastinate or have time blindness or.
You mentioned it like coming more naturally, to maybe more neurotypical people who don't struggle with executive functioning
Right.
skills. To me, it's looked similar to like the literacy journey, with like some of the members of my family have dyslexia and some don't. And for the members who do not, reading was intuitive. I just read to them and then they just started reading the books. They just naturally, like I did nothing to make it happen. It just, other than just reading to them a lot. And then for the kids who struggle with, or who have dyslexic brains, like they had to learn the skills like explicitly,
Right.
in order to get the hang of that. And I've noticed like a real parallel with executive functioning skills, and that it's similar, and that like the non-ADHD brains in our family, those executive functioning skills just feel intuitive and they just come really naturally. Whereas with the other, more ADHD style brains, like they have to be explicitly kind of shown like, oh, these are the steps for this, and this is how you break that down. And they have to like move through those experiences, but with a bit more like conscious intention as they do it, to like notice, get kind of meta with it. Like, oh, I noticed in order to make that happen, you did X, Y, and Z. Whereas the other family members don't. Like they don't have to have that going on in their conscious awareness to be able to execute it.
Yeah, so I'm glad you said that because so there's a term in the teaching world. It's called direct instruction. So there's direct and indirect, and you use the term explicitly. So that would be like direct instruction. So that's like, yeah, so what happens a lot of times is that a middle school or high school will give all the kids a planner. So they'll print up a couple thousand of these planners and they'll hand everybody the exact same planner. So there's no differentiation. Inside the planner, there's usually a couple of pages that tell how to use it. But do you think the kids with executive function challenges read that? No. And so they do need direct instruction. They need to be taught how to plan. And then I won't go into too much detail about that, but you can look into my work to figure that out. But basically, what people listening want to know is that you do want your kid to know how to do what I call a daily plan. And then you want them to know, at the very least, they should know how to plan their day. And then they should know how to plan a little bit about with long-term goals. And I usually use, if I'm using digital or analog, I don't care, but I usually use a monthly planner for these kids because they can see the big picture. I teach them shorthand because they want to put as little effort into it as possible, and I respect that when it comes to everywhere they can cut corners. That's fine. But they do need, and then as far as planning, they also need, and so for those of you taking notes, the skills that are important to Seth with how to plan. First, I want you to think about what's the big picture, and then what are the subtasks. And then what I do when we're planning the day is I always ask, what is your NOP or your MIT? So what is your number one priority or your most important thing? Why do I ask what is your number one priority? Because these kids don't prioritize naturally. So asking the question, what is your number one priority, gets them to have to think, oh, well, I need to do this thing or that thing. It forces them to think about the priority. So I say, what's your number one priority? Now, I might question it. I might say, are you sure? Or how do you know that's your number one priority? That's a great question. Even if you know, oh my gosh, they are so far off. They have three things that are more important than that. I don't care about that. I care about their thinking.
Yes.
Right? So I'm not going to ruin the opportunity for them to learn. I'm going to say, wow, how do you know that's your number one priority? And see where they go with that. But so then I want to ask them, what else do you have to do? So, do you have to clean your room? Do you have to do math? Blah, blah. So you have your number one priority. Then you have your other priorities. Then I want them to think through, how long do you think these things will take? Why, Rachel, do you think I would ask them that question?
Because lagging executive function and skills include an inability to estimate how long something will take very accurately.
Yeah. Yeah. So they have this like time blindness and so, they say 15 minutes, 30 minutes. I mean, it doesn't matter if they're wrong, but I do on the way I teach planning, I do have them jot down, what they think is going to happen. Because not that I want them to learn how to perfectly estimate it, but I want them to have the skills, build the skills to start to calibrate time, to start to be able to think through. Because I don't want them, being 25 years old and not asking the question, oh, how long is it going to take me to do laundry today and this and that, like they have to start thinking, how long will this thing take, and seeing when they're wrong and how off they are so that they can start to say things like, oh, I'm the type of person who has to leave 10 minutes early. Oh, I'm the type of person who sets my clock differently. Or, oh, I'm the type of, so that they have tools that work for them. So, and then I ask them, what order do you want to do them in? Because these are the kids that they'll just like open up a tab or pull out a piece of paper out of the backpack or whatever and just start working on something, but they're not thinking through like, you would say, oh, what should I do first? What should I do second? They're just like, okay, I'll do something so that they don't bug me and they think I'm doing work. you know so what order? So it's, what are the what's your number one priority? What are the other priorities? How long do you think these things will take? And what order are you going to do them in? And of course, it's daunting for me. For those of you listening that are like, Seth, I can't do this every day with my kid. Okay, so don't, but do it sometimes, because these are skills that have to be built with planning. So that was a lot about planning, but
Well, no,
should I move on, or
no, I just
you
want
want
to
to?
add, I strongly recommend, like what I often see is that families will feel very stuck and miserable because they're trying to work on this skill set through tasks that the kids don't want to do anyway. And so I would invite parents, like if that you anticipate that this would be so sticky and bring about a lot of conflict, to start working on those skills with things that your kids are highly motivated to do naturally, like things that come from them that are self-directed. For
Excellent.
example, like when my kid wanted to take a camping trip with friends to a different state, I said, like, cool, like what do you have to do? Like what do you need to figure out first? Like moving through that planning process that you talked about in for things that they really want to do and that they feel like full ownership of,
Yeah.
and are highly, like if they're teenagers and they're really motivated by like peer relationships, so looking for context to give them more ownership over executing these experiences that they really care about. I've found like that's really where I see big jumps in that executive skill development, because they're so motivated to do it.
Right. Yep. Yep. That's a really good strategy. Yeah. And when they're resistant to doing the things, one of the reasons for the resistance one of the reasons, I mean, it might be that it's just not interesting to them or doesn't feel meaningful to them. But another reason that a lot of times they don't want to do things and are resistant is because it's too abstract.
Yeah.
They don't know how long it's going to take. All they know is it's daunting. They don't know what the steps are. They don't know what the pieces are. So planning helps to make the abstract concrete, and it makes it much more doable rather than just sort of this vague sense of, oh, I got all this stuff to do.
Yeah. Yeah. My teenager right now, she was offered a car for free, but she has to figure out how to get it transported here because it's in a different state. So like things like that, I'm like, oh wow, that's such
Teachable moment.
yeah, like that's such an exciting opportunity. Like, so how do you get a car from there to here? It's like, okay, well, first I need to like research like the way other people do that. Next I need to, but like actually executing those. And there's a timeline because the other person's like, if you want it, I need it gone by such and such date. So again, like just kind of looking for those opportunities, I find it really helps to overcome that resistance that might come up if you're trying to do this around like, say turning in a homework assignment, something that they really don't care about and they're not interested in. I feel like it's a lot harder.
Yeah, and then anytime in a situation like that you can layer in other things, um, again, because this is there's a lot of motivation for this one.
Mm-hmm.
Then anytime you can build in other things, do it. But a great opportunity in this one, which is related to planning, is okay. How do I try to get her with some buy-in and ownership to create a project management document, or to
Yeah.
use Google Keep or Asana or Trello or some sort of system? It could just be a doc, where she
Mm-hmm.
can collect the phone numbers of the people and the addresses and the notes on documentation that she has to be aware of, or whatever those things are, so she can start to make sense of the scope of the project.
Yes. Love it. Love it. Okay. You mentioned one thing I want to like touch a little bit more on, because you mentioned it briefly earlier, was about like the messages that kids who struggle with executive function often receive. And I know you said like lazy or
Right.
irresponsible. Like, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know that there are a lot of like parents even who struggled with executive functioning, but didn't have the language for it. And their families, maybe labeled them as lazy or irresponsible. Like, what are some of those messages that people receive and why are they wrong?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about shame and how we really feel shame in the body, and there's a difference between can't and won't. And what happens is that we use shame when we think that it's a won't.
Mm.
So basically, if we're thinking, you know, this child is being willful, they're being defiant, they won't do what they're being asked. That's one story. So that's a story that leads to the messages like, oh, you're lazy, you're just unmotivated, you need to motivate yourself, you just need to try harder, you just don't try hard enough, you're just undisciplined, you just don't care about school, you just don't care about this thing. So those sorts of messages are very shaming, and we're trying, our intentions are to motivate them, to get them moving on something. But it does not work that way. I mean, we might put pressure on or use things like punishment and rewards, which only work in the short term, or
Hmm.
the shame or anger or these sorts of things do not address the fact that these skills do not exist to the extent that are needed for what we are asking them to do. Even when we say, "But I've seen you do it before."
Yes, I was just going to say that. I have to
Yep.
highlight, like, even when, like, we've seen them do it once before, or we've seen them do it in other contexts, then we just have this expectation that, oh, so you have this skill and you can execute it 100% of the time. And that is not accurate.
Yeah. So if we perceive it as a can't rather than if it's a won't, then it's the lazy, you're unmotivated, you don't try. If it's a can't, then we ask a very different question. If you can't do something, then the question is, well, how do I empower you? How do I help you learn the skills to do the thing? So, and then the problems with the shame also is that they internalize it. And then they start to think, I'm bad. I'm not a good person. I'm not good enough. I'm broken. There's something wrong with me, or I'm stupid, or I'm not smart. And then they start to really, after they've internalized it, they start to change their internal narrative to be like, stuff's too hard. I can't do anything right. I give up.
Yeah, they like adopt that shame story and internalize it.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then undo it for decades.
Yeah,
So I
seriously.
don't mean to make light of it because it is not funny because I mean
Um,
I'm sure many of the people listening have gone through that as well, but we've learned it, from how we grew up. We've gotten this sort of messaging. Like I don't fault anybody for it, but once we start to learn that it's not okay, we really need to start digging in and figuring out a different way and really looking at the can't and really compassionately and empathetically like teach these skills.
Yes, yes, particularly because like lagging executive function skills, they can be on the challenging side of the neurodiversity coin. Like we talked about, they're characteristic of some neurodiversities like ADHD because of that underactive prefrontal cortex. But brains who struggle with this particular aspect of functioning also have strengths that help them to be tremendously successful in life. Like my husband
Yes.
is tremendously successful, not in spite of the way that his brain is wired, but very much because of the way that his brain is wired. So, what are some of the strengths that you have witnessed or experienced that come along with this style of brain wiring? And how
Yeah,
can we like center those strengths?
that's a good question. So we really do want to have strength-based education. We want to build upon strengths. So like your husband may have really big strengths but wherever his weaknesses are, he may be good at delegating. So the parts that he does, yeah, so he gets to stay in his lane, to do what he does
Yes.
well. So I'm gonna throw out a couple words. If you're taking notes, you might jot these down because I rattle them off. But what, in my opinion, we want to do is we want to build upon strengths, interests, passions, curiosities, talents, gifts. We want to build on those things because traditional school, even if you're homeschooling or unschooling, you have been indoctrinated in a culture that of traditional schooling. So you've been influenced whether or not you like it or acknowledge it. I'm just going
Mhm.
to tell you that.
Yes.
So what we want to do is look at how can we, with whatever educational experiences we're trying to provide, how can we build upon the strengths, interests, passions, talents, gifts, things like that. So the strengths that and then I also, I wouldn't say like I think there's a book called The Gift of ADHD. or the gifts of ADHD. I would not say my ADHD is a gift. I would say there are gifts in the way my brain works, but I don't want to downplay the reality of the challenges that I still experience, even with all the tools and stuff that I know. So there are. I am going to answer your question, by the way.
Take your time.
But I just want to make clear that I don't want people walking away and being like, oh, this is all a gift. No, I mean, again, this is about choices, opportunities, possibilities, and we do not want to limit them. And it has limited my life. It has limited the life of, I have a great life today, but let me tell you, there are and were challenges. But so one of the gifts of a lot of people with ADHD or executive function challenges is the outside the box thinking, the unconventional responses, answers, solutions, thinking patterns. The ways that they look at problems can be very unconventional, outside the box, and different. And so which means that they can come up with solutions that other people wouldn't be able to come up with. They can also be very flexible in their thinking, where someone with very strong executive function can be very rigid and really, really need routine and patterns and predictability. They can a lot of times deal with a lot of flexibility and really take their thoughts into very different places and notice things that other people wouldn't notice. They also can often improvise really well. They can really be in the moment, really be, humor and play. Oh my gosh, those are gifts that people wouldn't normally think of. I mean, those are so important that they can be really funny and playful and just have really quirky ways of looking at things. And their ability to, transition. Part of executive function is transitions, and transitions can be hard for people with executive function challenges. So like, let's say getting out of the house and into the car and at the place on time, prepared with everything you need. That can be a difficult transition, or transitioning from middle to high school can be difficult. But their ability to transition from task to task can also be really fluid. Like now those are structures that have time requirements and things like that. But for them to be able to like transition into just, from one activity to another and change in a playful way, in a creative way. I mean, I guess that's another thing, is the creativity that their brains are so flexible and able to transition in a good way, to be really creative and come up with really unique ideas.
Yes.
So
That's
those
so
are some of
helpful.
the strengths.
No, I love it. It's helpful for us to to keep in mind. I love everything you said, when you first started talking about how like really the most like effective, really just coming at education through that strength-based lens, like what, like building upon that, like you talked about creativity, like if that's a huge strength of your child's brain wiring and who they are and what they're passionate about, like building upon that and getting at all of the other educational things kind of through that doorway, and the skill building things like we're talking about here through that doorway, through those creative pursuits that they're passionate about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so can neurotypical folks struggle with this skill set too? Like what other factors can manifest as executive function difficulty?
Yeah. Well, yeah, anybody can struggle with it. So I guess you have your people who struggle with executive function that might have a formal diagnosis, and then you have your people who don't, and then you have your more neurotypical people who, let's say that executive function's on a spectrum, and let's say that the spectrum goes from really poor executive function to really strong. So, you can have your people with good executive function who have challenges in certain areas of it. So, and we'll link to this, the skills assessment, because I think this is helpful. Because if you look at the assessment, I only talked about 1 out of 13, so I'm not going to go into that depth like I did on planning, but I can mention them.
Yeah.
But what I did on this is that I put how the skill looks. So you could say, for example, one thing that I am really bad at is prioritizing. my brain just doesn't get it. So one of the strategies that I've had throughout my life is I don't know, I'm able to self-start, but my prioritization is horrible. So as long as I'm doing something, I'm going to get the important things done. But my brain I cannot wrap my head around which one should I do first. It just doesn't work. So, but I have found, skills to start so I get enough things done. So, basically, people can say, "Oh yeah, I really struggle with this, but I'm really good at that." So yeah, people can. I'll go through those real quick. So the next one is organized or organization. Okay. So then the next one is the prioritization, being able to prioritize the important thing over the fun or easy thing when it matters. The next one is the focus, concentration, and attention, and staying on task and not getting distracted. And the next one, number 5, is like inhibition or self-control or self-management or being. And inhibition is how the front part of the brain helps us to hold back and pause and not just call something out or say something impulsive. Impulsivity is the opposite of inhibition. So there's an inhibition, that's an executive function. And number 6 is self-starting or task initiation or not procrastinating or activating. So those are skills. Again, it's not just choosing to self-start. It's that you have skills, a pattern, a way that you get yourself started. You don't just start. You actually go through a process, even if you're not aware of it.
Yeah.
Maybe you get organized 10 minutes before, or maybe you make a list, but we have ways to task initiate. Then we have task persistence, number 7, which is follow through or finishing or persevering or persisting. And then we have transitioning, like I already mentioned. That's shifting from activity to activity, and being on time and prepared. Then number 9 is working memory. That's sort of short-term memory that helps us keep things in mind when we're doing something. And then we have emotional regulation. And that's pretty straightforward. And then metacognition, that's an interesting one because I do want to dive into that for a second today.
Okay.
So
Thinking about thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then number 12 is skills to move through that resistance. So when we feel like, oh, I don't want to, this is dumb, why do I have to do this? This stinks. How do we move through the resistance? And that's very related to the emotional regulation to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is self-care. That can be sleep, nutrition, exercise. But it can also be, bathing regularly or brushing your teeth or things like that. So if somebody, you said neurotypical, like maybe they struggle with the task persistence. Maybe they're good at doing 90% of something, but they aren't good with persisting in the follow through. Or maybe they struggle with emotional regulation or whatever. So
Yeah. I think one of the questions that we got when I mentioned that we were going to talk about this was like if trauma affects a person's executive functioning, and if so, like how can we approach this skill building in a way that's trauma informed? And I don't know if you feel like that's within your wheelhouse to answer. I'll just offer that when we're wrestling, a good simple comparison for people is like grief, because a lot of people tend to understand that like the brain kind of has only so many units of energy, and if so much of it is working on processing grief or like metabolizing a grief, then a lot of people who are grieving report like a brain fog, like they have a lot of trouble with executive functioning skills, like following through on tasks, showing up on time, things like that. And we can kind of understand it as like the brain only has so many units of attentional energy. And really a lot of the same things can happen with trauma too, where if our brain is always kind of reacting and responding in these traumatic, trauma response kind of ways, it just eats up a lot of the parts of our brains that we could normally dedicate to this kind of stuff. But maybe you have a different perception.
no, it's funny. So 2 or 3 hours ago, before you and I started today, I actually did a training for a school district about trauma informed. And I have a video on my YouTube channel or on my website, sethperler.com, that is called something like the number one thing I think schools need to do or something like that. But it's be trauma informed. That is
Uh,
the number one most important. Does trauma affect executive function? 100%. I mean, if you are experiencing trauma, whether it's grief, as you're saying, whether your parents are going through a divorce, I mean, any number of traumas, it's going to be hard to plan and focus and not be impulsive if you feel impulsive, and to be able to inhibit yourself and to your the brain fog, the working memory is going to be impacted. And
yeah.
so absolutely trauma absolutely impacts executive function a lot.
Yeah, like there's a lot of overlap between like complex PTSD and ADHD, a lot of like comorbidity in those diagnoses. And a lot of people, like therapists, people in my sort of circle are trying to figure out like how to tease those apart, or are they teasable apart? Like, where's the line between the two? When can it be both or one or the other? Because what they look like can be so similar.
Yeah. Do you know polyvagal theory?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, imagine imagine that executive function, the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the front part of the brain, is helping us to do the important things. But imagine that we get a sense. Imagine, let's do something super concrete. We are planting a garden outside in the yard, and we're planting a bunch of vegetables, right? A lot of tasks, pretty chill. But all of a sudden, we notice that there's a big snake. So, and let's say that the snake is kind of far away. Are we going to be, relaxed? Well, probably not. And then let's say we see two or three all of a sudden. I mean, we are the prefrontal cortex. We're trying to focus and concentrate and plant the garden and work on this. But at the same time, the brain, our senses are looking to detect threats to our safety. Then we notice something. Maybe there's a sound and we hear the rustling in the leaves that maybe, and then we look with our eyes. So we use that next sense and we see, oh, it's a big snake. And we're like, okay, now we have a narrative on our mind. There is the snake that could potentially be dangerous. I might not be safe. I might be being threatened. So then the brain sends a message to the amygdala, a very small part of the brain, and says, dude, wake up. Something's wrong. And the amygdala is like, cool, I got this. The amygdala sends a message to the adrenals. The adrenal sends adrenaline to the heart, sends it to the muscular system. So we're ready for fight, flight, or freeze. If we notice that snake is coming right up at us, we're going to jump up and run back. I mean, we're not even going to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And, so all of a sudden we're into flight. So you clearly are not even thinking about what you were executing on a minute ago with the garden, because now you are concerned with your safety.
Yeah, and
So,
evolution designed our brains to literally, there's like a mechanism that closes the door to the prefrontal cortex when
yep,
the amygdala takes over, because like you said, like if a tiger is about to pounce on us, we won't survive if we're sitting there thinking about like, well, what kind of tiger is it? And how many feet away is that tiger? What should the first step be that I do? Like
yep,
we have to just run, right?
you
Or
have to
freeze,
respond.
or yeah, you have to respond.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when we're talking about people who are really deep in the weeds with their traumas, like they are in that part of the brain, it's even access to that prefrontal cortex is so severely limited.
Right. So then when we shame and we're like, let's say
You're
you
lazy.
don't know that somebody has had a traumatic experience, or there's big T and little t trauma,
Yeah.
or you don't know that they've had little t trauma, where it's sort of like an ongoing, like traumatic, not a big event experience, but an ongoing trauma. Like, and then you're like, stop being lazy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to punish you. You're being bad, like that is not what somebody needs in that time.
Yeah.
So yeah, how do we compassionately and empathetically like guide them to build these skills? But yeah, trauma 100% impacts executive function, 100%.
Yeah. And it's funny because most people wouldn't think of like safety as being like step one on building a skill set of executive functioning. But if part of what's, leading to their contributing to their struggle with executive function is trauma, like then building those skills of safety, whether that's literally like helping them create safety or more like psychologically helping them to, you know, create a sense of safety within themselves. Most people wouldn't necessarily see those as connected, but they very much are.
Yep.
Okay, so what, Seth, are your favorite resources for us to dive deeper into this topic?
Well, ironically, it would be things around stuff like that, like Deb Dana and Stephen Porges, and Julia Caldwell. So people with polyvagal theory stuff. So Deb Dana, there's a book called Polyvagal Theory in Therapy, I think, and it's fantastic, and it's very accessible, so you don't have to be a therapist to read it. Anything on it from Stephen Porges, and I think Stephen Porges has been on a lot of parent summits. And Julia Caldwell with she does something, she talks about like above the line and below the line, and
Yeah.
then there's Stan Tatkin, or anybody in the attachment theory world. So I like Stan Tatkin, and I like a little known person named Alan Rabarge, who's a YouTuber. I don't know if he has any books or anything, but it's just fantastic attachment wound stuff. So those are, I guess and then John Kabat-Zinn, Wherever You Go, There You Are, stuff about mindfulness, meditation. Wherever You Go, There You Are, that book has like 3-page chapters, so it's very accessible, and it has try these little experiments. So it's super, like, if you don't understand mindfulness, that's a really good intro to it.
Yeah. And then what about executive functioning skills in general? Where do you, and you can include all of your good stuff in there too.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Seth Perler guy, like
his YouTube channel, first of all, is fantastic, super fun, tons of resources there.
Yeah, I YouTube pretty much every week, and so the YouTube channel, SethPerler.com, or executive function on YouTube. I don't even know what my channel's called, but my site, SethPerler.com. I have a lot of free resources, and then I have a summit called ExecutiveFunctionSummit.com, where I get together. This year, I'm going to get 30 speakers. This will be my 4th year doing the summit, and it is mind-blowing. It'll be in August, and it's a tremendous weekend, just full of people around executive function. Like, they're just amazing. So yeah, those are some things. As far as other executive function resources, who I like a lot is Russ Barkley. Now, Russ Barkley is very clinical. I try to be very practical. He is not, but he is amazing. So I tend to like Russ Barkley quite a bit. And there's just so many. Actually, if you look at the summit and look at the speakers, any of those people.
Nice. Okay, well, Seth, thank you so much for coming on and sharing a conversation with me about executive functioning skills. This is one of those things that, like, I feel like I've kind of been working with families around executive function, like, for as long as I've been working with families, so like 20 years or something. But really, like, the language around it has just kind of exploded recently, and the awareness of it has exploded recently. More of the research is starting to be developed around it. So I'm so grateful that we now get to like have conversations about it, and we have all these new like structures for it, really, to talk about it and to work on it. So thank you for helping to bring this into all of the thousands of homes that are listening to this conversation. Just thank you for your work. Thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. That's one of my intentions. I've been doing this for 12 years now, but I want to get the term into the lexicon in a meaningful way. So when I started, you really never heard about it. Now you hear about it, and some people know what they're talking about, and some just know a little bit. But I really just wanted people to understand so that we can really help more and more kids. So, yeah.
Agreed.
And I wanted to say thanks for what you do too. The world needs you, and I really appreciate just how you show up, how you've created this body of work that's just really making a difference, and really impressed.
Oh, thank you so much, Seth. I'm sincerely taking that in, and I sincerely appreciate it. And I'm going to link to all your good stuff and tell everyone to go check out your website and your YouTube. And if executive function is something that's on their minds, to seriously consider signing up for that summit and getting exposed to all these new ideas and these new strategies. And just thank you for everything.
Yeah, you are welcome.